Hello, I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. Welcome to Bubble Pop. You know it by now. This is the weekly show where we talk about some of the biggest headlines and juiciest news tidbits so you don't have to doom scroll. And just a reminder that at the end of the show, I'm going to leave about 10 minutes while we're live for your questions. So if you have any, you're welcome to leave them. I will prioritize ones using the super chat function, but feel free to ask them anyways, because I try to grab as many as I can. And if you'd like to support the show, you can also subscribe on Patreon, Substack, YouTube, as well as anywhere you like to listen. I am very excited about today's guest. She has been at the heart of some of the most integral moments of Canadian politics in recent weeks. And she's got the metaphorical scars to prove it. Green Party leader Elizabeth May was the lone opposition MP who voted to support Mark Carney's government in a recent budget vote. Here's that clip.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Merci, ma question.
Thank you. My question is for the Prime Minister.
Agree that it is a deficiency in the budget that our legally binding Paris commitments are not mentioned. Can he confirm here on the floor of this House that in passing this budget, the government is committed to holding to as far below 2 degrees as possible, to funding climate adaptation, to delivering on the nature strategy, and continuing to engage in meaningful Indigenous reconciliation?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Honourable...
I'll have to ask the Prime Minister to start from the top. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member for advocacy of the Youth Climate Corps, which is in this budget and which this House can vote for. Vote for the future of this country. Mr. Speaker, this budget puts us on the path for real results for climate, for nature, for reconciliation. I can confirm to this House that we will respect our Paris commitments for climate change, and we're determined to achieve them. I can confirm with this House that, consistent with our Kunming Montreal commitments, the nature strategy will be released in the coming weeks. We will build this country strong, sustainable, and pure for future generations.
Elizabeth May only agreed to do that after Carney had affirmed Canada's commitment to meeting its Paris climate agreement. So a little over a week later, though, Mark Carney signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta that clawed back several Trudeau-era climate policies and paved a pathway for a potential pipeline. This left May telling reporters that Carney, quote, needs to consider what his word means when his word was given. I think the many Canadians who thought they voted for a guy who cares about climate policies have been wondering the same thing. All of this has left me dying to have a conversation with the Green Party leader, and luckily, she has obliged me. I am very excited to welcome Green Party leader Elizabeth May on this show. Elizabeth, welcome to Bubble Pop.
Listen, Rachel Gilmore, I have so much respect for you as a feminist journalist who doesn't put up with any garbage. So I follow you on socials, and I'm really happy to see. Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to spill all the beans there are not yet spilled.
Excellent. I can't wait. We loved spilled beans here. Love spilled beans. So the first question I have for you in light of that is just, how are you doing?
Well, I have to say, I mean, the word that was broken wasn't just what you heard on the floor of the House of Commons. One could argue that he still means to do all those things. It gets harder. But specifically in the budget itself, and there were several rounds of negotiations with me to get my vote, not to go through all of it. But one of the things that was very clear, I mean, well, you're not going to be able to read this at home, but it says right here that the fossil fuel subsidies would not extend to, quote, it says, quote, but not enhanced oil recovery. So this requires a little bit of techie background in that something called carbon capture and storage is at best of dubious value. It's hugely expensive and it doesn't work all that well. But what the idea is that you shoot carbon dioxide that you capture, shoot it underground, and then keep it there. Now, one of the things about carbon capture and storage is that when you're shooting the carbon dioxide down underground, and particularly in areas of oil deposits, you can actually liberate some oil that wasn't moving. So it's stuck. It didn't come up when they drilled the pipeline, whatever drilling didn't get it. So it actually happens that when you shoot down the carbon dioxide, you can use it to get more oil out. Now that has nothing to do with climate, it's called enhanced oil recovery. So that's where we drew the line and saying, look, in the negotiations before November 4th, and working with the minister who had been the Minister of Environment, was now Minister of Canadian Identity, Stephen Guilbeault, we're trying to make sure there were no new fossil fuel subsidies in the budget so that, because it's been said for years that, subsidizing big oil to find oil is like subsidizing fish to swim. I mean, that's what they do, and they make billions of dollars out of it. They don't need public subsidies. In any case, that was a solid win that it was in the budget. It was unhappy making to discover that they'd snuck in a different fossil fuel subsidy for fracked natural gas. But what I never thought would happen was that the stuff that was in the budget in writing in black and white would be reversed because the memorandum of understanding with Alberta specifically says, and the investment tax credits for carbon capture and storage will include enhanced oil recovery. So that was a shocker, and I was shocked, and so was Minister Stephen Guilbeault, now former minister in Carney's cabinet. And we've also seen now resignations from two of the experts that the government appointed to its climate institute. This is not making me happy person. How I am. I'm emotionally. Well, I'm emotional. It's horrible to watch Stephen Guilbeault. I don't know how many of your viewers watch the French media, but particularly his interview on Tout le monde en parle, which is the most popular television current events and entertainment show in Quebec. But on Tout le monde en parle, and on a number of other interviews, Stephen was very candid that he told the Prime Minister, we promised Elizabeth. I mean, that's very personal. It's not just we promised the Green Party or we made promises to opposition parties, but we promised Elizabeth, and she voted. She voted with us because we made this commitment. And what is our word worth? So to see Stephen leave cabinet after all that, he's obviously, anyone serving in cabinet makes compromise after compromise, but not since Jody Wilson-Raybould has such a high-profile minister on principle walked away from a cabinet post. So it's made me incredibly sad. And it also means, and when Stephen and the climate experts are all agreeing, that what the Prime Minister has done since that clip that was November 17th, by November 27th, signing that MOU with Danielle Smith, and that same day, Stephen Guilbeault left cabinet. It's been a very hard time because what I really care about more than anything in this world is that my granddaughter and other grandchildren of everybody. I mean, we have made the world an unsafe and insecure place because of our pollution. There are lots of other reasons to worry. It's not one thing alone. We're in a poly-crisis world, and we've got Trump to worry about. We've got Putin to worry about. We've got Netanyahu to worry about. And they're all doing things that make the world less safe. But honest to God, I really didn't think that having gotten those commitments to vote for the budget, that those things would be sort of like confetti thrown up in a parade and swept up with the garbage the next day.
Yeah. And, I did want to hear a little bit more about the process of you getting those assurances? Like I read your piece in Policy Magazine was really fascinating from that respect. And I was shocked to read that you actually didn't know for sure what you'd be doing even going into question period, because you didn't know if Carney would rise and affirm this commitment to the Paris Agreement. But can we take a couple steps back, and you can tell me sort of when these conversations started and how that went?
Sure. And I don't, it's tricky to talk about this because I find that when I say the government didn't seem interested on how opposition parties were going to engage on the budget till the last minute, then that some guys get like, oh, she was annoyed that they didn't pay enough attention to her. And that's not my
Yeah,
point at all. This is a minority parliament.
exactly.
And I've been through a lot of parliaments, minority and majority parliaments. And generally, uh, the party in power, particularly when it only has a minority of the seats, does want to engage with other parties early so that they go into things with something like a consensus. Now, there have been examples of this in the past that were stunning. I mean, way back when gosh, John Turner used to tell the story about when he was Minister of Justice and Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister. And as Minister of Justice, John Turner would invite the opposition party critics for justice to a dinner privately to discuss new legislation to see what they thought about it. So by the time it got entered for first reading, he had consensus. The idea that you don't engage people early is not healthy in a Canadian democracy. We're a multi-party parliament. There's 5 parties in parliament right now. In any case, I was somewhat surprised that, and I think my colleagues in the NDP have said the same thing. They were surprised. There's 5 NDPers, and there's me as the sole Green, and the Liberal government is short. Now is short 2 seats of a majority. That went from 3 to 2 when Chris d'Entremont crossed the floor from the Conservatives to join the Liberals. Now, maybe they didn't think, this is just me speculating, maybe they didn't think they needed to talk to the NDP or me about how we were going to vote because they really thought they had a lot of Conservatives coming over to them. So that was a miscalculation because whatever happened, Chris d'Entremont was the only one. Matt Jenner was widely speculated to be about to cross the floor. That's another whole drama and intrigue, and I think a fairly nasty story of whatever it was Pierre Poilievre's inner circle did to Matt Jenner to make. He's a very good guy. I mean, I know everybody in Parliament. I'm very fond of Chris d'Entremont as an example. He was a progressive conservative Nova Scotia MLA and was the Minister of Environment in Nova Scotia. So these are people I've known a long time. Matt Jenner, not so much. He's a lot younger, but he's really liked across party lines as a stand-up guy. In any case, they were short votes, and you would have thought they'd start talking to us sooner. So my first meeting with the Prime Minister since the election wasn't till October 2nd. After that kind of surprised me. I wrote long letters of advice, not about climate, but about things like how to make Parliament work better, ideas for how to assist the new incoming minority government. And it could just be that they didn't have their offices set up right. But I didn't even get a thanks for your note. We'll get back to you a week from never. I mean, it's just like I was, as I
Wow.
said, as my ghosted, right? So I'd been in touch
Yeah.
with Mark Carney even through the election, even when he was campaigning in my riding to defeat me. I thought, oh, I can't take it personally. I'll still send him little notes and stuff. So I'm really anyway. I thought we'd be in touch after the election when he had a minority. We met for the first time October 2nd, and I'd submitted my party's submissions for the budget. Some of your viewers may be surprised to know the Green Party platform was the one that got rid of the deficit faster than anyone else. And that's not because we would cut key services, but because we know where the money is and we decided to go after the money so that we'd have more government revenues. So we wouldn't be, what this budget is doing is from the get-go announcing we're going to spend $78 billion more than we have. That's what a deficit is, spending more than you got. It's not the same as debt, but $78 billion in a deficit is kind of shocking. But in any case, we've given them ideas, for instance, the financial transaction tax. The Canadians wouldn't have felt it at all unless you were a billionaire, that kind of thing. We'd submitted a lot of recommendations and not had not been engaged. So October 2nd, when I met with the Prime Minister in his office, was a good conversation for sure, but not primarily about whether different ideas the Greens had were in or out of the budget. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a very high-level conversation. October 7th was the first time anyone in the Liberal government asked me flat out, can you vote for our budget? And I said, well, of course, I haven't seen your budget. Nobody's seen it. This was October 7th that I was talking to Steve McKinnon, who's the government leader in the House and Minister of Transportation. Honestly, Rachel, I mostly wanted to see Steve McKinnon because being an MP from a riding that's coastal, we have a ton of issues with Transport Canada, and I wanted to talk to him about some of those. In any case, he asked me point blank, would you vote for our budget? I said, well, I'd have to read it first. But I can tell you one thing, I won't vote for any budget that has new fossil fuel subsidies. Just no. He said, what? You'd vote for an election? And I said, no, I'd vote for my granddaughter. I will vote for my granddaughter's future every time, and I'm not movable on that. So somewhere between then and November 4th, when the budget was tabled, and I repeated what I'd said to Steve McKinnon in some media interview, somebody said, have you told them what you need to see in the budget? And I said, well, there's lots we'd like to see, but the only thing I've told them directly is I won't vote for a budget with fossil fuel subsidies. Now, I sort of pieced this together for what happened next, some of it now from Stephen Guilbeault's interviews he's given publicly, because I don't necessarily know what's going on. I know what I'm doing, and I don't know that I found out from some of Stephen's most recent interviews that he was, quote unquote, dispatched by the Prime Minister to talk to me. I can tell you, Rachel, that negotiations began in a serious way to say, we're going to try to, we won't put fossil fuel subsidies in there. And Stephen Guilbeault, I think, did a lot of heavy lifting to persuade them that although they were putting tons of money in for the carbon capture and storage, again, which I consider a waste of money and a fake climate solution, but at least don't subsidize the part, the enhanced oil recovery, that lets the oil industry make more money by getting more oil, which undermines, keeping it simple, undermines my granddaughter's future. So don't be producing more fossil fuels with public money. When we got that, and Stephen Guilbeault told me, we've got that. It's no enhanced oil recovery will get a subsidy. So that was a win. When I opened the budget, this thing, to read it, and I found on page, as I said, page 348, but not enhanced oil recovery. Okay. Then I was shocked to find that they'd stuck in a different subsidy for liquefied natural gas. Now, there's a lot of misunderstandings out there about liquefied natural gas. It's actually not natural gas in the projects we're talking about now, because the easy to get at natural gas is mostly tapped, and like the offshore Sable Island had in Nova Scotia had actual natural gas. You tap into it. But what we're getting now is called fracked gas, where you break through the subsurface of the rock to find deposits of gas. So you're fracking both actually causes earthquakes in northern BC, where they're fracking a lot. Fracking injects toxic substances underground to get the gas to move. Well, it doesn't move swiftly into a pipe. It is mobilized, and a lot of it enters into the atmosphere as methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas that warms, actually unit per unit, far more powerful a greenhouse gas at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. It's just there's a whole lot more carbon dioxide than there is methane, but methane is a very powerful and dangerous greenhouse gas. So fracking, actually, even though there's all this propaganda about how liquefied natural gas will be great, we can send it to China, China can burn it instead of coal. But because of all of the upstream, product process of smashing the subsurface substrates to get the natural gas out, that fracking has the same carbon footprint as coal. So subsidizing getting the natural gas from the substrates of geological formation is not a climate solution at all. It is not clean. So to find new subsidies for liquefied natural gas and fracking in the budget was very distressing. And I think I wasn't the only one distressed. I don't think they told Stephen Guilbeault that was going to be there in there either. As well as I mentioned, of course, in that clip, there was in the printed budget no mention at all of the Paris Agreement. There was no mention of the Kunming-Montreal commitments Canada made to a biodiversity treaty to do a better job protecting nature. And the sections on Indigenous reconciliation didn't mention things that are critical, like the Indigenous Guardian program. And then I was getting emails from the Native Friendship Centers across Canada saying, we think we've been cut. And Friendship Centers, for people who don't know, there are a very large population of Indigenous people in Canada who live in urban areas off reserve and don't get services. And Indigenous urban people are really, really up against it. And these little teeny weeny Native Friendship Centers in cities from Winnipeg to even a little town like Mission, BC, Native Friendship Centers do a huge amount of work connecting people in need with medical help, with job training, with just to sit down and have a meal. So I became very alarmed that the budget was much worse than I thought, and I was looking for changes. So first phase of negotiation, to make it clear, was before November 4th to try to remove the subsidies. And then the next phase started when I read it and thought, I can't vote for this at all. And that was November 4th that we started talking again. And then I was talking to the Minister of Finance and to the Minister of National Identity, as Stephen Guilbeault's title was at that point, and to other members of Parliament, parliamentary secretaries. And I had a brief conversation with the Prime Minister in a corridor, sent him my ideas, and which we know had been sending along to him through emissaries and whatnot. So it wasn't a concentrated or planned negotiation, which would have made some sense. Like, we're meeting today, this is a meeting, you're meeting with so and so, and next meeting will be on such and such a date. It was, and then we had to break away from Ottawa for the week of Remembrance Day. And I just stayed in touch with as many folks as I could inside the Prime Minister's office, as well as individual members of Parliament who are Liberals, like parliamentary secretaries and other ministers, texting, phoning, emailing, like, is there going to be anything, or I'm voting no. Just so you know, I'm not budging on this. Unless there's something more, I have to vote no. That gets us to the vote November 17th. And then 10 days later, as you say, the deal with Alberta wasn't just troubling. It was a flat out reversal, like X out page 348 of the budget. But of course, it's still there in the budget. I'm shocked by this. In any case, it was it was fairly shocking, but I have to say the most shocking thing about the whole thing for me, it was for Stephen Guilbeault to be and to speak so personally and in real moral terms, to say, how do I look myself in the mirror if I pretend this is okay? And I gave my word, he said. We gave our word, he said to the Prime Minister, to Elizabeth. I mean, it's very personal when he speaks something like that. We gave our word to Elizabeth, and she kept her word. So that's why and I don't know where this lands, because I like being in a minority parliament and as leader of the smallest party in the House, but I am the leader of a party in the House. And I will continue to try to negotiate with a minority Liberal government. But I'll also try as hard as I can to hold them to account, because I never voted for a Liberal budget after Justin Trudeau bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline and wasted $34 billion building it. I mean, in that period where Jagmeet Singh and Trudeau had their deal, and sometimes I get thrown into that. People say, oh, well, you were just propping up the Liberals. No, actually, no, I never did. I haven't voted for a Liberal budget since Justin Trudeau bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline and wasted $34 billion trespassing on Indigenous lands against their will. Depending on the nation, there were differences of opinion, but honestly, that was a horror show. And now this is clearly worse. So I
Yeah.
have to try, right? I have to keep trying to get them to improve on their policies. But this was the word betrayal is just impossible to ignore in these circumstances. This was a betrayal.
Yeah. What was the moment that, and I kind of got a sense of it from your Policy Magazine piece, but was there a moment that you really did feel like Carney initially had won you over? You felt good about your vote. What was the
Absolutely.
thing? Like, did you fully trust him in that moment when he stood in the House
But
of
see,
Commons?
this is how I read Mark Carney. Now I've known him since he was governor of the Bank of Canada, and his wife Diana Fox Carney is well known as someone who's a climate activist. So, and I read his book Values, and I read his speech in 2015 when he was governor of the Bank of England. He gave a quite famous speech to Lloyd's of London, which was brilliant in anticipating that the problem for climate crisis is always that you've got politicians with short time frames, and you really have to work to make changes now to see the effect in future. So I had reason to expect him to be, and I'd seen him at numerous climate events over the years. We had at least a conversation at the Glasgow COP and at the Dubai Conference of the Parties. And he was the special envoy for Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, on climate finance. So this is an interesting thing. He came to the Glasgow Climate Summit in 2023 and had with him, he basically had, this was the first COP since COVID. We'd missed meeting in the Conference of the Parties because of COVID. And he was the kind of the belle of the ball. They were rolling out the red carpet everywhere because Mark Carney showed up having called some friends that, he's an international financier. So as envoy for climate finance, he showed up in Glasgow having gotten together $138 trillion of investors who said, we are prepared to invest in climate solutions and transition off fossil fuels. So, I mean, that was a very important accomplishment. Now, all of that has since, all of those banks and all of those financiers are no longer committed. They are elsewhere. But, in terms of what moment would I trust him, I tend to be a trusting person, but I guess I am naive because when I realized that the last Liberal rally of the whole national Liberal campaign in the April 2025 election, their closing big rally with the Prime Minister there was in my riding. And honest to God, Rachel, I don't know, I said to my husband, talk about naive. My husband used to be a federal Liberal. He's repented and he's a Green, but he actually went to the Green Party before we got together, the two of us. So another, for completely off topic, but for women watching, if you're single and you want to find somebody, I got married for the first time at age 65, and I've got a great guy. But my husband was a federal Liberal, and so when I said to him, honey, do you think, when I found out he'd done his last rally, Carney's last rally in my riding, I said, honey, do you think maybe he doesn't know it's my riding? And I know John said, honey, they know it's your riding. I mean, like they're trying to kill you. How did you miss that? But anyway, I don't take these things personally. And when I called Mark Carney the night of the election to congratulate him on forming government, he congratulated me for holding my seat. I thought, this is going to be great. We can have a good working relationship. I always hold on to that hope. So in the context of the budget, and you could tell from that clip when all the Conservatives are roaring at him when he stood up, it's because that's the first time he stood to answer one of my questions in Parliament since the election. So I asked questions Stephen Harper always answered my questions, which is interesting because Stephen Harper was okay. If a leader of the party is asking a question, even if it's the leader of the smallest party, and even if she's the only MP for the Green Party, at the very end of question period, when I'd get my question, Stephen Harper would rise to answer me. But in that moment, which was part of the negotiation, like how can we change what's physically written in the budget? Well, obviously, Carney didn't worry about changing what was physically written in the budget to do a deal with Daniel Smith. But the best we could think of between Stephen Guilbeault and me, François-Philippe Champagne, a bunch of people was, well, if I ask a question on the day that the budget is going to be voted on, and the Liberals gave me one of their backbencher questions. That's why it was well placed and early up in question period, not at the tail end. And I asked the question of the Prime Minister. When he rose to answer it, that's why the Conservative benches went ballistic. And there was so much noise that the Speaker had to say, the Prime Minister gets another time from the town. When he answered it clearly and said this government is committed to the Paris Agreement, and will work to achieve its targets and to the nature agenda and Indigenous reconciliation. It wasn't that at that moment I trusted him, but because trust is hard to come by, but I did believe him because I thought the reason he'd been evasive and he'd been ducking questions about whether he thought Canada was still committed to our Paris Agreement targets. You probably remember there were a number of questions where he'd say, well, I don't believe in objectives, I believe in results. So he wouldn't straight up say, I'm committed to the Paris Agreement targets. From that, I inferred that as a person of integrity and a person of his word, he doesn't want to say it if he's not prepared to do it. So the fact he said it made me quite sure that he would intend to do it. Now, part of the thing here too, and Rachel, I'm really grateful you're letting me give such long answers. I mean,
Yeah, of course.
most people would cut me off by now. But the thing about it is that what's in the memorandum of understanding with Alberta, and which often even seasoned journalists make the mistake of thinking that net zero by 2050 is a Paris target. Net zero by 2050 is, in fact, fraud. Net zero by 2050, the Paris target, as you heard in my question to the Prime Minister, was, will we stay as far below 2 degrees Celsius as possible? That's the language in the Paris Agreement. The world it's not stated in terms of percentages or deadlines. We've had different protocols over the years, but the Framework Convention on Climate Change is the major treaty. It was negotiated under Brian Mulroney. It was signed and ratified by Canada back then, and it was also signed and ratified by George H.W. Bush. If I got that right with the W's, the father, that George Bush in 1992. I mean, every world leader was there at the Rio Summit, signed and then they went back to capitals to ratify. So the U.S., despite Trump having a first term and a second term, the U.S. is still a party to the overarching treaty, even though they've withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Canada was always part of the overarching treaty, even though Stephen Harper withdrew us from the Kyoto Protocol. So we've had ups and downs, but overall, Canada has the worst record of greenhouse gas emissions of any of the G7 nations. So of the wealthy industrialized countries that we'd all agreed would move first because we can both afford it and develop innovative technologies that make it possible for us to be prosperous while living up to our commitments. We have the worst record because we keep increasing emissions. And the major reason for that is that we keep having the politics of Alberta and various Liberal prime ministers, going back to when Jean Chrétien had the Red Book in the 1993 election, dumped all the climate commitments within weeks of the election to try to get Liberal seats in Alberta. This is always the impossible dream of Liberals is that they're going to be popular in Alberta. That's not going to happen. Ever since Pierre Trudeau and the National Energy Plan, a lot of people have short memories, but Albertans don't, and Pierre Trudeau is remembered. And the Liberals have if we had fair voting, like proportional representation, a lot of Albertans do vote Liberal, but very few of them have a Liberal MP as a result. So the process of seeing the memorandum of understanding come out with Alberta, with every premise around climate action being net zero by 2050. Net zero by 2050 means we can overshoot 2 degrees, overshoot 3 degrees, overshoot even 4 degrees. And what that means in terms of the science of climate change is that we're at very large risk right now of hitting tripwires in the atmosphere. We don't know exactly where they are, but at some point, because global warming itself unleashes more warming forces. These are called positive feedback loops. So when our forests burn, as a relevant recent example, the burning forests of Canada this year released more carbon dioxide than all our industry. Now, it doesn't get counted against our Paris target, but it sure matters in the atmosphere. So warming, global average temperature increase, which is what the 2 degrees is, it's not localized, it's global average temperature increase, has to stay as far below 2 degrees as possible to try to avoid 4 degrees tripping us into 5 degrees, tripping us into 6 degrees, tripping us into 7 degrees. In other words, there is the theoretical possibility of ending all life on Earth through global warming. Now, nobody wants to think about that, least of all me. I go on the side of we've still got time to stop that.
Yeah.
But we don't have time to stop that the next 100 years are going to have climate impacts that get worse and worse. I mean, that we're locked into that.
Yeah.
So it's one of the things in John Valent's book, Fire Weather, where he said, don't think of this as the warmest summer in the last 300 years. This is the coolest summer for the next 300 years.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, so I live
Yeah.
in a world of this,
Yeah.
and I don't give up, and I don't think anyone who cares about democracy should give up. The signs aren't good that our democracy is healthy in Canada. Not good signs. Democracy in the United States, will it survive Donald Trump? Will there be more elections ever? These we have to be very, very committed to defending democracies around the world, to defending Ukraine against Putin, to defending and to working with countries that share our values, that are democracies, that care about human rights. So I'm very worried when we think, okay, we're going to diversify our trade. Right, we should have diversified our trade a long time ago. We should never have. John Turner, whom I mentioned earlier, was right in that election in 1993. That was a critical election to say no free trade deal with the U.S. We're much better off to be a sovereign nation and control our own economy. But diversifying our trade right now is critical, and we should diversify trade with countries with whom we share values. We don't share values with Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, where the Prime Minister just pulled in $70 billion of investments. So I'm very worried for our country right now, but I know we're way better off than any other country I can think of.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned earlier in your description of your experience with coming to the decision to vote with the government on this particular budget vote was you said that you felt as though Carney was a man of integrity. And I did want to ask you, do you still feel that way, that he's still a man, that he's a man of his word and a man of integrity? And if he were here instead of me, what would you have to say to him face to face about that?
Yeah, I saw it face to face at the press gallery dinner, and it was somewhat unnerving that his approach was one of when he asked how I was, I said, well, obviously not good. He said, oh, come
Yeah.
on. Kind of, we got to
Really?
keep up, and shook hands and kiss, kiss back. Okay, good. Well, he, I think we have to understand, which we didn't, where he has really strong background credentials and where he doesn't. So his strongest credentials are in banking. he doesn't have any credentials ever as being elected at any level of office, not municipal council or mayor or MLA or MPP or MP. So his understanding of how you get a parliament to work is thin. His understanding of how a CEO functions, how a banker functions. So I think his understanding of when you're you know getting the deal, and I'm sure he thinks all the deals he's doing, absolutely sure he thinks the deals he's doing are in the long-term interest of Canada. Obviously, for Stephen Guilbeault and me, the question of keeping your word matters, but I'm not going to condemn who he is at the level of his morality or character. I just think, okay, we have to understand who this is. And this is someone who's respected globally. He can pick up the phone and call financiers, people who control billions of dollars, and maybe that's what we need. I mean, I have to be fair about this. What on earth would any prime minister do if I were prime minister? I would keep elbows up versus Trump. I really would. I think kowtowing to Trump is not going to get us anywhere. I would say let's create some strategic reserves of Canadian natural resources to protect our industries from Trump's tariffs, which are designed to hurt our economy. And I don't want to sound mean, but let's hurt their economy. We go into a ring with a bully. And when Justin Trudeau was prime minister, he called all the opposition party members into the cabinet room. So leaders, not all the members, but Pierre Poilievre and I and Jagmeet Singh and Yves-François Blanchet sat down at the same table with Justin Trudeau in early December. And after Trump won the US election in November, said, what do we do? Can we be Team Canada? How do we work together? We met again in early December on a Zoom meeting. We met, or I guess it was Teams. And we met again in early January. Amazing. And then just a few days later, Justin Trudeau got up and said, I'm resigning as prime minister, so on and so forth. But the Team Canada approach that we all committed to as leaders of parties was to retaliatory tariffs. And when you get in a ring with a bully and you say, we're going to land punch for punch, well, you're not going to last long if you're the, if the guy you're in the ring with is 10 times bigger and mean, you're not going to last. But if you, I think I remember this in one of your columns, if you've got your car keys clutched in your hands and you're ready to try to go for the eyes, that's what we should do with Trump. So I would like to create a strategic reserve of potash. Trump has famously said, Canada doesn't have anything we need. Well, yeah, actually, we do. We have quite a lot of stuff you need. So if we got the Parliamentary Budget Office to cost this for us during the election campaign, that every Canadian could buy a bond, the Saving Canada bond, not the Canada Savings Bond, the Saving Canada bond, with a 5% guaranteed rate of return, we could buy up all our potash so the potash producers get paid. We could store it. We could wait till the U.S. is crying and begging for relief because they bought all the potash they needed for this growing season. But so there's things we could do. I would do different things than what our prime minister is doing. That said, Trump is unpredictable, and the relationship with the U.S. is in a very different place, where now I think absolutely we should get rid of the idea that the United States is a safe third country. And if some refugee comes to us through the United States, we should turn them away because they were safe in the US. Oh, yeah? Have you seen the ICE brigades going in and raiding schools and neighborhoods and community centers? So the US is no longer a safe place for LGBTQ people, for marginalized people, for people with brown skin. And U.S. citizens born in the U.S. are being deported to countries, and they're bombing vessels off the coast of Venezuela without any sign of due process, such as knowing who's there and what they might have done. So back to whether I trust Mark Carney, he may be exactly the right prime minister for now. I have to recognize where we are geopolitically. But for me, no, I'm never voting confidence in this government again. That's as Stephen Guilbeault said in a different interview, we've burned that bridge with Elizabeth. That's correct. I'd have to see it in black and white, and when I saw stuff in black and white here that was reversed within 10 days, that's real hard to figure out, really. And now that maybe it may just be that if enough other people resign from Carney's caucus or his cabinet, there are a lot of Liberal MPs who have spoken out, particularly British Columbia MPs like Will Graves and Patrick Weiler, and Toronto MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, in saying, well, this MOU is taking us in the wrong direction. And now, as I said, experts are resigning from the Climate Institute. Maybe it will cause the PMO to have some second thoughts, even on their electoral calculations, given what they're doing. How many seats do they lose in Quebec of people who've always respected Stephen Guilbeault? How many seats may they lose in coastal British Columbia when their Minister of Energy, Tim Hodgson, actually said of the coastal British Columbia First Nations were way up the coast, closer to Alaska than Vancouver. And he says, oh, we can talk to them on Zoom. Now, he did apologize, but it's revealing that both the Prime Minister and Tim Hodgson don't understand First Nations and sovereignty enough to know that when you say, oh, they'll like this MOU eventually, and the Prime Minister said this too, because they'll make money out of it. And the hereditary leadership of coastal BC First Nations know what will happen if a tanker loaded with dilbit spills on our coastline. It's not even as bad as the Exxon Valdez spill was of crude oil. Diluted bitumen isn't crude oil. It's a tarry substance, bitumen, mixed with diluent. That all the evidence in the assessment hearings was that you could never clean it up if you had a spill. So that's why, I mean, it isn't some sort of, they treat the oil tanker ban, I was just in a debate in Parliament on Zoom minutes ago, and they act like some of the Conservatives act like the oil tanker ban was some sort of virtue signaling Justin Trudeau affectation. This has been in place for 50 years. It was initially a voluntary moratorium, but the reason for it was never climate action. The reason for it was we have to protect our coastline. We have billions of dollars of industry in the British Columbia economy premised on tourism, fisheries, and we also actually do care in British Columbia about wild salmon and endangered southern resident killer whales. The population as a whole really in British Columbia cares about our coastline and does not want to have oil tankers putting all of that at risk. So it's First Nations for sure, and they are the rights holders. But settler culture Canadians like me and in our millions in BC care about our coastline. We're not rights holders, we're citizens of a country called Canada, but we respect the sovereign rights of the First Nations in this province. As I wonder what the hell the province of Alberta, the MOU pledges to build nuclear reactors all over Alberta. Did they talk to any Alberta First Nations about how Alberta First Nations feel about nuclear waste? These are not good economic decisions. I want to underscore that. What's in the MOU with Alberta is not good for Canada's economy. It's also really bad for First Nations rights. It's also really bad for climate action.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, I want to make sure we have just a couple minutes here to take some audience questions. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I'll turn over to them now if you guys want to drop some questions in the chat. And just a heads up that I'll give a little priority to super chat questions. So I'll give you guys a moment. And while you do that, I have two sort of rapid fire questions that might be difficult for you to answer in a rapid fire way because they're kind of big ones, but I really wanted to squeeze them in here. The first is, you called for Stephen Guilbeault to join your party. Have you spoken with him? Is he considering it?
I won't speak for Stephen. He needed some time. I respect let's face it, I love him. We've been friends since 1992, but I tend to love everybody. It's just something. It makes it really possible to work in the House of Commons, not to what people see on TV is not how we really are together. He needs time to think about it, but one of the benefits, well, I think one of the things that people don't know about the Green Party, how different we are from every other party, it's against our rules to whip votes. We expect every member of parliament to read all the bills, to understand what we're voting on and make a decision ourselves. Is this what my constituents would want me to do? So it will take time for, I'm hoping Stephen would consider it, because I think being a backbencher liberal, I know he said, well, if it was an election, he would rather have Carney as prime minister than Poilievre.
Yeah.
Yes, so would I. Doesn't mean I don't think we should have a stronger force in a minority parliament with MPs who can push Carney to be progressive, because right now he's taking all the Conservative Party policies and enacting them. So, I mean, I think tactically what the Liberals are doing are trying to cut the Conservatives off at the knees by taking all their policies and rhyming slogans and enacting them, so that they will be more likely to form a majority government when they go back to the polls. That's what a lot of this is, electoral politics. What I'm thinking about is healthy democracy needs a larger group of MPs who represent progressive concerns, which include actually more economic sovereignty and keeping elbows up versus Trump, as well as making sure that we protect our resource industries and act on climate change. We need more MPs in a group who, in a minority parliament, can push Carney back to where the Liberal Party used to be, more on the left.
Right. And this is a bit of a totally different direction, but it's helpful because I had a question that someone who had asked on my Twitch live stream on Tuesday night. They said they wanted to hear your answer on when I mentioned that I was likely having you on. And there's also a super chat question that's asking something sort of related. So I did want to ask you about your, in 2016, your party decided initially to sort of adopt a specific position on BDS, and you quite vocally opposed that, saying BDS is polarizing, ineffective, and unhelpful in the quest for peace and security for the peoples of the Middle East. Obviously, even then, there was, serious human rights abuses from the Israelis towards the Palestinians, and has been for a very long time. I'm wondering if your position on that has changed and if you regret your position from 2016.
No. Well, the position is not really about, because we did adopt a consensus position. Greens operate by consensus. I mentioned how we're different from other parties. We had an aberrant convention in 2016 where, without approval, the chair decided to use Robert's Rules of Order. Now, we'd always used green rules, which require trying to achieve consensus. So we actually had a very divisive vote on a very narrow margin. And Indigenous Greens in the room said, what is this about suddenly Greens are more concerned about colonizing and settlers in the Middle East? What about our rights as Indigenous people in Canada? It was very divisive. And we did step back, convene a group to work on a consensus document. We had another gathering within months and adopted a policy for us, which is still our policy, that supports the use of sanctions against the Netanyahu government, the use of boycotts and consumer information. So you can tell, for instance, this is a product of what I consider legal Israel, or is this a product of illegal Israel with companies operating on Palestinian territory. So investment, boycott, divestment, sanctions are all steps that we would use. But the BDS movement, as sort of an NGO, non-government thing, included some things that we could not agree with, which would look like we did not respect the right of the state of Israel to exist. So we got ourselves to where we needed to be by consensus. So it's complicated because we're, as in democracy, and the Greens are the most democratic party, take time. And that was a very distressing and aberrant moment where we didn't use our own rules. And when we use our own rules, we're good. So we were the first party to call for ceasefire after October 7th. We condemned unequivocally the Hamas assault on the kibbutz, Hamas's attacks. But bear in mind, Netanyahu has been funding Hamas for years. Netanyahu's and there's a Green Party in Israel, and the leader of the Green Party of Israel, Stav Shafir, said, please don't, miss the fact that, and she wrote this piece for an Israeli publication called Haaretz, that the far right Likud under Netanyahu and Hamas share the same goal of unending conflict. And it's the moderates in the middle, it's people who want peace, who have to make common cause. And that's where the Greens are. We're always going to try to find a way to make common cause, but we will, we're quite horrified, obviously, by the assault by Hamas, but the assault of Israel on Gaza is a war crime and a genocide. And we have been I'm very, very pleased in the change in Canadian foreign policy to recognize that the state of Palestine exists. But now what are we going to do about it? I think we're going to need to have to help Palestine create itself. We're going to need to have peacekeepers in the region. I'm one of the founders of the Canada-Palestinian Parliamentary Friendship Group, and we made a tour that included every MPs from every party, 18 of us, all 5 parties represented. We toured the West Bank in spring of 2018, and the menacing threat of these people that are called settlers. The Israeli settlers are paid by the government of Israel. They get their housing for free, and they're paid to steal homes from Palestinians. And walking down the street in Hebron, I'll never forget seeing, you'd normally say, oh, what a nice family. There's a mom with a stroller and a baby and a dad, but the dad has like a machine gun strung across his chest and a belt full of bullets and guns. And his look towards us, as we were such a bunch of Canadian MPs, was so menacing. These guys are scary, and they're stealing Palestinian homes, and they're killing people. Someone's got to go over there and do a police action and get those so-called settlers either in jail or back in Israel. But Palestine needs to be able to get rid of these illegal so-called settlements. I mean, Rachel, I don't know if you've been there, but they're not. I thought it was people taking hammer and nails and building themselves their own house. No, these are major infrastructure projects on which millions are spent on separate highways that are only for Israeli license plates. And the people of Palestine, Palestinians, if you've lived in Hebron all your life, or your grandparents and your great-grandparents, and you always used to be able to go out your front door and to the market, they've built walls and gates, so you have to go all the way around the outside and around the perimeter, and then maybe be let into the market. And the Israelis settler people have stolen the buildings on either side of the marketplace. I was walking through the marketplace to buy some souvenirs and looked up and wondered, why is there chicken wire across the top of this open market? And then I looked up and I saw that stuck in the chicken wire were all kinds of projectiles, bottles and rocks and things. And our guys, the Israeli settlers who stole those apartment blocks, throw things down at the people who are trying to buy things in the market. Now, this was just routine, and this was in 2018. So obviously the assault on Gaza and the West Bank that's occurred since October 7th has been 10 times worse, more violent, more deadly. But one of the first ingredients to a genocide is to tell people that the people you don't like, the quote unquote, the other, are subhuman. And I met with a wonderful group when we were in Jerusalem. We met with a wonderful group called Breaking the Silence. It's made up of, because of course the Israeli society has a mandatory draft and mandatory military service. But this wonderful group called Breaking the Silence are veterans of the Israeli Defense Forces who said they've just got to tell Israelis what's really going on and how they were routinely sent in to homes in the middle of the night to roust everybody. No evidence that these people were dangerous or had ever done anything wrong, just to make sure They said it was a policy called making our presence felt, that the Israeli army would just routinely scare the hell out of people, snatch their children, and arrest them. So we wrote as a group, all 5 parties wrote a report and gave it to the Justin Trudeau government, saying that Canada has to do more, as the church groups in Canada have been saying, that arresting children is not okay. So Netanyahu's government, and I separated out very much because, as I said, my friend Stav Shafir, who's the leader of the Green Party of Israel, they don't have any seats in the Knesset, but she did at one time, and she's saying, make it clear that it's not Israel you're attacking. It's the Netanyahu government. There are good Israelis trying to get to peace. There are good Israelis who want to form ongoing partnerships with Palestinians, and they cannot be lumped all together any more than we would now say that because of Trump there are no good Americans. Of course there are. Of course they are, and they need our help because they're in a country being run by someone who is essentially a thief. In broad daylight, he's robbing his own country to enrich himself, and he's basically a fascist. So
Yeah, I will
we
say
have
there
to
are polls
care
that
for
support that a
Americans.
lot of Israelis are on side with much of what the Netanyahu government is doing. It's very pervasive and systemic in a way that needs to be addressed beyond just isolating individual extremists because of so much of that being throughout society. I mean, even in 2022, more than 3,572 Palestinians had been killed in the last decade, including 806 Palestinian children. And, Israel controls 85% of Palestinian water, the checkpoints, there's so many pervasive issues. We saw Israelis protest to get IDF soldiers who had raped Palestinian prisoners released. And, there are really systemic issues that I think must be addressed. And
there's no question.
do you support a full 2-way arms embargo and an inquiry into the Canadian?
Of course. No, of
Yeah.
course. I've signed every open letter that our Canada-Palestinian Parliamentary Friendship Group. We raised it first. I raised it first in Parliament that we had to have an arms embargo. And of course, when it turned out that despite the fact we were told, it was so far back that Melanie Joly was the minister at the time, said absolutely we're not sending arms to Israel. And I'm not sure. I think that they actually managed to getting these arms shipment to Israel on commercial planes under under Air Canada flights to Tel Aviv. I don't think the ministers, I don't think Melanie Joly or Anita Anand knew that was happening on their watch. But a full impartial investigation. Of course, we support a 2-way arms embargo and bring charges under the International Criminal Court against. If Netanyahu sets foot in Canada, we should arrest him.
Great. Well, Elizabeth, I've chewed up a little more time than I had intended to. So I should probably wrap things up. I'm sorry to the folks. There were a few super chat questions that we weren't able to get to, but I might maybe email them to you in case you have time, and I can drop them in the YouTube
Rachel.
comments. But thank you so much for your time today, Elizabeth. I so appreciate it. And hopefully I can have you on again soon because this is really fun.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And I'm sorry, I don't know what super chat is. You see,
no,
but I would
YouTube
love
stuff.
to
Don't worry
answer
about it.
any super chat questions.
Great. I'll email them to you. And we'll put them in the YouTube comments.
You've got it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon.
I hope so. Thanks, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bubble Pop. I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing on YouTube, Patreon, Substack, or wherever you like to listen. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitch, and Blue Sky. I'd like to give a special thank you to Hans Vivian Wenzel for making the incredibly groovy music for Bubble Pop. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify under the artist name Hans. That's a lowercase h with an exclamation mark. Thank you again for spending this time with me. This is my dream job. I know I say that every week, but that's because it's true every week, and I couldn't do it for 1 second without your support. So Thank you, and I'll see you next time.